Welcome to Leadership Moments.
In every great leader's life, there are pivotal moments that shape their character, test their resilience, and awaken their vision.
Together, we'll uncover the invaluable lessons hidden within these transformative moments. Today, our guest is Kim Korber. Kim has over 30 years of leadership and executive presence working with organizations providing services or producing products in the chemicals, energy, and advanced materials industries. He has established trusted advisor relationships with senior level executives and their teams across borders and cultures. Today, Kim helps leaders to find their success moving into new roles, expanding their emotional intelligence, increasing team effectiveness, and advising on talent stewardship. He also mentors new venture entrepreneurs and coaches those transitioning careers from military service. Today, we're going to talk about Domestic Violence Awareness Month and how leaders can become more aware and assist those in need. Let's get going. Kim, I'm so happy that you are here and thankful that you agreed to do this show with me today. This is our first episode for the month of October. And so also October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And so we decided together, actually you had the idea, that we should talk about this and what domestic violence can look like and feel like as a leader if you notice it, and things you can do as a leader to help other people that you want to help. So I first just want to give a warning to our listeners. We're not going to get graphic or into specific details, but we are going to give some examples of what may happen, and we are going to talk about some stats around domestic violence. And so if you are not in a location or in a mental state that's the right timing for you to listen to this episode, please press pause and go ahead and listen to it later. I hope that you find a way to listen to it sometime in the future, because I do think this is an extremely important topic, not just as awareness, but as leaders. I always say we are leaders of the world, not just leaders of our organization or leaders of our team. And this is something that I think we need to be aware of. So Kim, first, thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you, Stacey. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about this because, as you point out, it is an important thing to be aware of as a leader. It can be very uncomfortable as a leader knowing how do you help somebody on your team or somebody you may know in your family or a friend who may be addressing some of these circumstances.
Yeah, and let's get into some stats around this first. So first of all, in 1987, October has been the month for bringing awareness to domestic violence and educating to encourage support for victims. So this has officially been the month of awareness since 1987. And also, victims of abusive relationships are not only women, but men and children across all circumstances and cultures. And when we say domestic violence, it's not just physical. So you need to remember that. And then the effects of abusive relationships do enter the workplace, which is why we are talking about it on this show. And we may not always recognize it. And so we wanted to bring some things to light during our conversation today. And Kim, I know you have some other fascinating stats. Would you like to share those, please?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really becomes important, and of course there's different ways that you can look at this, but essentially, there's about 10 million people a year that are directly impacted by domestic violence or abusive relationships. And that doesn't include the people around those individuals, right? Family members, spouses, those sorts of things. The other thing is that essentially, what the stats show is that somebody becomes a victim of this abusive relationships every minute. And so there's like 20 people. So by the time, let's say in a 45-minute podcast, you have almost 900 people who've been affected by it.
Wow. Let's just, can we pause there for a second?
Yeah.
So 45-minute podcast, 900 people. So our podcast typically is about 20, 25 minutes when we have a guest. 450 people by the end of this episode, if we go the full 20, 25 minutes or whatever, have been impacted. So I just want the audience to think about that for a minute.
Yeah, absolutely. It's we don't tend to think about it perhaps until we've experienced it, but it is out there. And sometimes it's happening in ways that you may not recognize. And I know we'll talk about that. The other thing, Stacy, too, is, as you had mentioned, it's not just women who are impacted by this. It is men. It can be children, right? The children that you have, stepchildren, those sorts of things. The other part of it that sometimes we overlook is that abusers typically are in the workplace too. And in fact, there's some stats that say about 75% of the people who are abusers have made a phone call, have sent a text message, sent an email, or otherwise acted while they were in the workplace, right, to actually abuse the victim. So it's something that we need to realize. They're victims, but there also are the people who are the abusers that we find in our workplaces as well.
Yeah. And so we as leaders, if we're really listening, if we're paying attention to our team members, we talk about that all the time, having connection with your team members, understanding who they are, what they're about, being engaged with them. These are some things that you can look for, whether they are abused or the abuser. I mean, I'm not saying you're going to go read their text messages by any means or anything like that, but there may be some signs there. And I think, you'll have some stories later, Kim, that might show some of those things, but it's really good stats. So thank you for sharing those. I think it's important for us to have awareness on those. And so, Kim, I'd love for you to go into, and obviously we're going to keep confidentiality, but you having quite an extensive career in HR in your past. I know you're doing other things today, but in the past, you fortunately or unfortunately have had some experience or have seen some things where you've had to help people in these situations. And I'd love for you to share a story that helps our leaders understand on maybe what they could look for. And later, we're going to talk about what to do and what not to do and how to handle it. But let's talk about some examples first, just to get some insight of what it may look like.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is, apart from dealing with this in the workplace, I also think, why is this an important topic to me? Well, I've actually had situations of domestic violence and abuse in my own family. So I know very well, how scary, how frightening, how embarrassing, this can all be, and the impact that can have on everybody around the person who is actually the victim, as well as the person who's the abuser. So some examples. Well, I think the ones that perhaps, are obvious that people would look at is where you have two employees in the workplace who are in a relationship, right? And then suddenly the relationship becomes sour and now people act out, right? So we see that. Or in some instances, it's, the people notice, somebody shows up with bruises, or there's that person who maybe has a spouse or partner who suddenly shows up at the workplace. And it's, obviously there's problems outside of the workplace, and this is happening. And now, a supervisor, a manager, or coworkers have to deal with it. So those are some of the ones that are obvious.
Yeah, when you talk about, we know a lot of people meet their significant others through work. And so there is workplace dating, whether it's part of the policy or not, and whether you can do it, people still do it. And when you make the comment of people acting out, what could that look like?
Well, that can literally be everything from that person who's constantly showing up at that other person's sort of desk or workspace. It can be people who are just excessively texting or walking away from where their normal work area is, and they're having to go talk with this person. So you might see somebody leave and go out into the parking lot and have a conversation with this person. You might actually notice that suddenly there's this whole flurry of complaints about this other individual that when you look into it, you may discover, well, there's not necessarily a lot of clear evidence or witnesses there, but essentially it's that person trying to create difficulties for the other individual. And sometimes it can be where you see somebody get very jealous, right? So if a person is working and they have coworkers where maybe there's social opportunities for them to engage, this person, may feel very uncomfortable. They may say, like, I can't participate, where the other person may actually show up and say, I don't want these people talking to this person. I don't want them to go. And I've actually seen that where it was very awkward for a group where the person showed up and they were very clearly intercepting anybody who was going to be trying to talk to this individual.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. And, you mentioned earlier, and I appreciate you sharing with our audience that you've had it within your family and have experienced it. And, we've known each other actually for a couple of years now. And when we were talking about this episode, we learned from each other that we both have experience with this. And so I have had experience as well. And when you talk about these examples, unfortunately, I was on, neither end is good, but I was on the abused end. And it was not physical, but it was highly emotional. And so you would not have seen anything physically, but what you would have seen is me withdrawing and shutting down. And I stopped talking to most of my friends. I didn't hang out with my family very much. I avoided work events whenever I could. And as a leader, that was very tough. And so I was highly successful in my career, but my personal life was in shambles, let's just say. And, and so I bring that up, and I like your examples because it doesn't have to be a bruise, a physical sign. There are other signs in the way the person's acting, and people complaining that they might be acting out, as you're saying, in the way that they're performing or not performing in their work that they haven't in the past. Like there's something that has changed in the way that they work or the way that they communicate or the way that their relationship is. And sometimes, you learn that, unfortunately, when people may become addicted to situations, but it can also be something like this. And so that's why I think it's important to understand that. And we can talk about the what a little bit. But, when we were talking, you mentioned maybe an example of someone who was an abuser at the work environment. Would you care to share a little bit of that story just to understand kind of what happened and what was experienced?
Yeah, one example that comes immediately to mind was this was a male leader who was very well respected by his peers and the team that he was leading. But what happened was some very loud conversations were overheard when he was on the telephone. And that led to some rumors that were happening, which, by the way, turned out to be true, that he was actually abusing his partner. So when he was at work, he was trying to be very controlling, very directive about what this person could and could not do. And when people heard that, it was a bit of a shock because they're like, well, this is a person that I trust and respect and in every way is performing well. And people were surprised that there could be that change in personality. And so that actually became a concern of the people around him. Was like, okay, well, if he could be this way, what could possibly trigger that? Would he ever do that to any of us? And so that was a concern. And then on the other side of it, there was a very accomplished woman executive who suddenly started to get very aggressive with people. In fact, people said she was, being a bully. And as that situation unfolded, what came to light was she was actually in an abusive relationship herself. And so her way of dealing with that was to actually act out at work. So there weren't any physical signs. There weren't any unusual things happening in terms of phone calls or visits or those sorts of things. But people had noticed her demeanor had changed. Her attitude toward other people had changed. And it just was getting progressively worse. And part of I'll call it the process of understanding what was going on with her was to finally get to a point where she was prepared to say, like, look, I'm in a relationship. I feel trapped. I don't know what to do. And that's why I'm changed. I've changed how I've approached other people. So those are just a couple of examples.
Yeah, those are really some great examples. And thank you for sharing those. And, another thing that we talked about it that you mentioned is it may not be, I'm not the abuser or the abused, but I am very close to a family member that may be, whether that's children, whether that's sibling, like whatever that may be. Do you have any examples there that might help our leaders understand on how people might react or what they might need?
Now, there's a couple I can think of, Stacy. One is a situation where the person wasn't, again, directly the victim, but there were some child abuse issues going on. And so they actually had to go to various court dates, appearing as a witness, but also, trying to seek some protective orders. And the person was, for all kinds of reasons, not wanting to have this become part of the public dialogue, right? So they didn't want their coworkers knowing about it. And at the same time, it was a very serious issue for them that they want to deal with. So they had attendance issues. They were showing up late. They had to call off suddenly. A number of different things, and the supervisors and managers, who were involved were certainly, like, okay, what's going on here? And the person wasn't entirely comfortable coming out and speaking about that. Another example that I recall was a leader whose daughter was away at college, hundreds of miles away, and the daughter had reached out to her to say, "Hey, I'm in this relationship that has now become emotionally abusive, but was actually essentially making some excuses for, hey, I just need some time. I'll work this out. I really care about this other person." And of course, for her mother, she was very alarmed and not sure what to do. And the daughter was over 18, so she's an adult. And so that was a pretty dramatic situation where you're at work, you're leading a team of people, you have this going on, you have all the concerns, all the sort of disruptions, if you will, that you might anticipate when you get those unexpected phone calls, and you're worried about your daughter. And so for them, it started to impact their performance and their focus and their ability to make decisions. And people did notice it. And it was not something that they obviously wanted to come out and talk about, that this was going on.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing those. And obviously this is all in complete confidence, meaning like we're not sharing names. This is something years and years ago. But we want leaders to understand what things can look like and what to look out for and how people can just show up differently. Like, I know I keep repeating myself, but it's just so important when we talk about, I think, what was your stat before, 75% in the workplace?
Yeah, the people who are abusers, 75% of those who are abusers have actually engaged in some abusive behavior or action while they were actually in the workplace. So even if it wasn't directed towards somebody who was a coworker, it could have been directed at somebody who works at an entirely different place. But people were taking, if you will, time or the company resources, using email or phones or those sorts of things to do it. Not every situation involves that, but there are people who clearly will do that, or they go out to the parking lot and use their phone. But the fact is that if you think about it, it's not just people getting abused at work. The people who are the abusers are probably also at work, and they find time to do these things. So it doesn't just happen on weekends and after hours.
Yeah. Okay, so real talk. I'm a former leader, and I've always been taught, right, that, hey, you need to be careful what you say. You don't get involved in people's personal lives. You don't talk to them about things that might be going on outside of work. Like, you get the legal telling you and HR telling you, be careful, be careful, be careful. And so I've had a team member that was under this situation. And when I learned about it, I was like, what do I do? Like, who do I talk to? How do I handle this? And I want to talk about that a little bit, because the first thing the person said to me was, I don't want to work with HR on this. I don't want others to know. I just need you to know, because similar to your situation, right, that they needed to be gone more often than normal. They might not be as engaged as normal, and they were trying to be kind and letting me know that their performance may be reflecting as so, but they didn't want anyone else involved. So what can a leader do or not do when these things happen? What kind of guidance do you have? And let me just put the disclaimer out there. You should always probably check with your HR team yourself. Your organization rules may be different. This is just some guidance to give you ideas, thought starters. I'm going to say it that way. But obviously you need to do what feels authentic and feels real to you and safe to you as well. So, Kim, I'm going to hand it over to you to give us some ideas of how we should handle these situations as leaders.
Sure. And there's probably a little bit of a trigger warning for HR people in the audience around this. But, what I would say is there's a time and situations to involve HR. We can talk about those a little bit later. But to your point, because this can be so uncomfortable for leaders, maybe a good place to start is what shouldn't you do? And then we can talk about what you should do. So most importantly, don't ignore the situation. And because that's a tendency like, well, it's probably a private family matter. It's for all the reasons you just described, Stacey, people are like, I probably shouldn't get involved. But abuse it follows a pattern. It usually doesn't get better. It might stay the same, and very likely it's going to get worse. And so if you are, as a leader, if you are seeing or hearing, or people are coming to you out of concern about somebody in the workplace, ignoring it's the worst possible thing, frankly, that you can do. The other thing that I think that you have to be careful of as a leader is, as we've already mentioned, some of us have had our own experiences with this in family or personally affecting them. And it's very important not to judge the individuals, because there's no way you will know exactly their circumstances, even if they're with you at work, right? You won't have perfect knowledge of that. And you certainly won't likely know very much about what's going on with the person who's actually victimizing and being that abuser. So I think that's very important to be aware of. And, the thing is, a danger here is that if you, we'll talk a little bit about this in a moment, but if you don't approach it in the right way, it's very easy for the person who's suffering this to feel like, okay, I'm getting violated again, right, by being judged, or I'm being blamed. And again, without knowing that. So it's natural for us to hear something and maybe have a reaction to it, but it is very important that we don't let that sort of cloud our judgment about how to address the situation. The other thing, and this gets into particularly how not to really cause that person to feel like they're being more violated, is when you're asking questions, don't interrogate the person. This is one of the things that I've seen come up quite a bit with very well-intentioned leaders who are like, well, it seems like a logical question to ask, like, what are you doing that makes this person so angry at you? But just if you think for a moment, you've got somebody who, is being abused, and they've got all these emotions going on, and maybe they're being physically abused as well. And then to just ask them that question, like, what are you doing to make this other person that angry with you, really puts them in a bad place. They're not going to trust you. They're probably not going to open up with you. So that's just perhaps one example. Other times people will say things like, well, why would you stay with this person who's treating you that way? And there can be some really difficult dynamics. I mentioned this executive who felt trapped. She had children. There were all kinds of things with the family that she didn't feel that she could very easily walk away from it. And she was motivated to try to solve, if she could solve, the problem. So asking a question like that, again, can kind of put somebody in a very, very difficult position to try to articulate. And they may not really be at a point where they can articulate. They may be overwhelmed with emotions and concerns. Another one that you'll sometimes hear is people say, well, like, you have children, what's going to happen with the children? Right. So they'll ask that question, which again can be very, very awkward. Or sometimes people say, like, are you going to get somebody in your family involved? Do you have an attorney? Are you going to go file a police report? Again, all understandable why somebody might ask those questions, but for that person, and again, we're kind of focusing on the person who is the victim, for them, that puts them in a very, very bad place. to decide, do I want to open up? Do I want to reveal something that's very painful here, right? For them as an individual. So you don't want to interrogate them. And then the other thing too that becomes important, and I've seen this happen in the workplace, where there's this tendency, supervisors, leaders say, well, the safest way for me to handle this is to say, doesn't matter what your personal situation is, but if you're not performing, if you're not attending, if there are other things happening, your personal situation is not an excuse for it. And that might feel safe as a leader, but now a couple of things are going on. One, that person is hearing, okay, on top of everything else I'm dealing with, now there's the possibility of me losing my job. That can absolutely make the situation even worse, not just for how they're feeling, but if perhaps the person who's the abuser is like, okay, now this person is going to lose their job, that may actually escalate things. So it can actually be bad from that perspective. And it's not just that team member, right? Other people who are around who perhaps are noticing and seeing some things are saying, well, what kind of a leader would do something like that, knowing how deeply personal some of these things can be. So it seems like a safe place to be, right? But it's, but it's not quite the same situation as if you might be dealing with somebody who, maybe plays volleyball on the outside and isn't showing up as frequently as they should be on the job. So those are the things.
I got to tell you, Kim, now I don't know what to say. I'm completely scared of like, wow, well, it could cause this reaction. It could cause that reaction. And I get you with and why I would default to, okay, just show up to work, just do your job, like whatever. But, and I know you want to talk about some things that we could say. So help me. What are some things that I could say in those situations that are, I'm going to say, safer, maybe more inviting?
Yeah. Well, and to your point, I mean, they're so don't want people to feel like, gee, you said don't ignore it, but there are all these reasons why I might want to stay away from it and call HR. So I'll just say, again, to your point with your team member, for a lot of people, the first conversation shouldn't be with HR. It really should be with their leader or people who are around them, because that's who's going to see this. And that's really who they are going to look to for support, first of all. So, what should you do? Well, there's a couple of different approaches somebody could take, but I tend to believe it's important to just have a very simple way that you can consistently deal with these things. Situations are going to vary. You're going to hear some different things, but the way I would capture it is to really say, kind of keep in mind the acronym ACTS, ACTS, for ask, confidentiality, trust, support. And let me go through each of those and see what you think and how this can help your audience. So under ask, as a leader or supervisor, you either have noticed something or somebody has come and said something to you that they've noticed. And so knowing that you don't want to ignore it, what do? Well, find a private moment and just simply ask the person, are you okay? Now, the person is probably, unless they already have a pretty good relationship with you, isn't going to suddenly open up and divulge all these things that are happening for them. But just asking that question helps that person to know, okay, somebody's noticing, somebody's paying attention. And their response may be, well, why do you ask? And there, I think what you have to do is be very open with the person and tell them, look, I've noticed these things and wanted to share that with you. Or if somebody else has come to you as a leader, and this is sometimes awkward for leaders, is don't get wrapped up in who said or the details of what they said. Just briefly say, hey, people are concerned, and we thought it was important to check in with you. So that's the first thing. Seems simple enough, but it works. Just asking somebody, are you okay? Not getting into, going into the interrogation mode, right? Those sorts of things. The other thing that becomes important too around this is confidentiality, right? And not just confidentiality in the sense that, this person has a concern, but you got to realize the person may share something with you that for a whole variety of reasons, they simply don't want out into the workplace. Right. So for some people, the whole idea of, hey, I'm a victim is actually something they're afraid of, ashamed of, embarrassed by. Right. So they don't want that to happen. And if a person does choose to share with you, so they need to know they can trust you, right, to talk about their situation and understand that. And even if somebody says to you, well, everything's fine, don't really need to talk about it right now, it's never a bad idea to remind them, well, if you do choose to talk about it or want to approach me, then, understand that whatever you say to me will be kept in confidence. Right? So I think that's an important thing to do as well. And then on the trust side, so sometimes people might confuse a little bit of confidentiality and trust. Trust is a very different thing, right? What we're talking about here, because for a person who's been, again, we're not talking about the abuser, but the victim here, right? It's a huge risk for them to open up about some of these things. So they have to, first of all, they do have to feel like, are you sincerely interested in what's going on here? And are you really willing to give me the time and the space? Because remember, typically this stuff is about control, right? And not letting this other person make decisions. So if somebody feels like I can't trust you and you're going to try to force me into a conversation, that has a completely the opposite effect that you want to have here. And keep in mind too, the person who's that victim, they trusted somebody who shattered that trust. So it's hard. It really is hard for that person. So what can you do? You need to let them know, again, you want to help them. You're going to keep things confidential. But one way to help them with the trust a little bit is to say, look, whatever decision you make here, whether you want to talk about it now or later, is fine. I'm going to respect that. And the invitation to have that conversation remains open. And quite frankly, most of the situations I dealt with were not situations where you went in, you had that, are you okay? And all of a sudden, all the details come forth. It usually were situations where giving that person, a couple of days to think about it. And in fact, that's even a good way for a leader to say, like, okay, I've asked you the question. You've told me it's not something you're prepared to talk about now. I'll still treat it confidentially. By the way, I'd like your permission to come back and check in with you in another day or two and see what's going on. And that creates a nice, easy way for you as a leader to not feel like you're pushing that person into a certain direction, because essentially they may say, yeah, if you want to check back with me, that's fine. And that may be the moment when they've had some time to think about it and they feel like they're controlling the pace of the conversation and what's going to get said and how it's going to go. That they'll perhaps then begin to share some things and really say, well, look, this is what's going on. Again, they may not tell you everything, but it will at least get that conversation started. And you may then have enough information as a leader to say, okay, how can I help? Which is really good.
Can I have a question on that? So if you're asking the question, so we follow the format, ask, right? Are you okay? They say, I'm fine. Everything's fine. And then do you still say, hey, I'm available here, anything that you need? Like, how do you handle the trust situation if they're not saying a thing and they're saying that everything's fine?
Yeah, I think it happens. I think what you have to do with that person is say, okay, again, I'm going to respect your answer. If anything changes, I'm available to talk about this, and you can go back to, again, the reason we're even having the conversation is because I noticed these things. It's not typical of you, or people around you have noticed something. They're concerned for you. We're all concerned for you. And we want to be sure that if you need some type of help, that it's okay. Right. And this is again, maybe a terrible thing to say, but this is another reason why you just don't, as a leader, you just don't want to say, well, let me give you the number for HR. Because the person there is like, okay, now you're going to introduce yet another person who very likely, while they might not be a complete stranger, is completely distant from anything. They haven't seen anything going on. They haven't observed any of this. And so for that person, knowing again that you are allowing them to dictate the time and to have some control over that conversation, and that you're going to be supportive, right? We will talk about that in a minute, but that you're really sincere about what you're doing. That, again, it's a difficult situation for people to open up about.
For sure.
Did I answer your question, Stacy?
Yeah, that was great. Appreciate that. I think that's going to help our listeners quite a bit.
Yeah, it's again, if you, I hope a lot of people in your audience haven't had to deal with it, but if you've really had somebody who is in a situation where they are being abused and they don't want to be viewed that way in the workplace, it can be very difficult to get them to take that first step. You can't force them. All you can do is help them understand that the invitation is there for them to know they're not going to be judged, they're not going to be blamed, and that you sincerely want to help, and give them the time to think about that and appreciate that for what it is. Because it may be the first time somebody's saying, "Can I help you? I've noticed something and I want to help." Because sometimes even in families, they don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear about what's going on. Or you may be embarrassed to bring other people. So it may be the first time they're actually hearing those words. Are you okay? How can I help?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things there. So first, remind people of the acronym. It's ACTS, ACTS, which is ask, confidentiality, trust, and support. So remember those things. But you also talked about support and, not just saying, talk to HR, and we'll talk about when to go to HR in just a second here. I do want to ask you that. But I think you were referencing I know I've been taught, remind them of the employee assistance program if your organization has an employee assistance program, or EAP, as some may acronym it as. But that's to let them know that they do have some support available to them for free for a certain period of time or for nominal dollars, depending on the program and what it is. Is that what you mean by when do you feel you should bring that in? Do you feel like it's a good time to remind them during that time? When you talk about, if you need anything, I'm here, and also this is available. Any thoughts on that? Because I know there's varying opinions, and I'm sure there's going to be other people that will disagree with you, but I still would love for you to give your thoughts for our listeners.
Yeah. So first of all, again, go back to the notion that for that person, if they are going to reach out for help, the first place they're looking to are the people immediately around them, right? Especially in the workplace. And so as a leader or supervisor, if you have an EAP program available, I think that's great to be able to mention that. In fact, and we'll talk about this in a moment or two, there can be a lot of resources potentially as a leader or supervisor. You could introduce this person to, the EAP being one of them. But the other thing that I think sometimes leaders overlook is they go well, this is an unusual situation and I'm not sure really what I can do here. And they may delegate that to HR. And what I would suggest is for leaders that you can, once you have gotten a little bit more information, understand what's going on, now you can probably find a responsible way to help this person. A good example would be that individual who has these court appearances that they have to make. And to really work with that person to understand, hey, how can, when they get notified of a court appearance, how can they share that with you? How can you work with that person so that work can still be done, right? That person can still feel in control of what they're doing there. And also, ideally, if it's available, is how can we do this and not have them lose pay as a part of it? Very often, that is inside the control of the leader, right? It's not necessarily purely the purview of HR, certainly isn't the purview of an EAP, right? So there are things that we can do there. Other times it may be things like perhaps there is some risk that this person is going to get confronted. So do you temporarily reassign this person, from what might be their normal assignment? Again, most of the time these things are not long-term. They can be temporary, but that can give a little bit of a space of safety for that individual. It may be the case that person feels unsafe going to when they enter or leave the building that they're working in or the work location. It may be, as a leader, you can certainly work with them to either be able to perhaps park their car a little closer to where they enter the workplace and exit the workplace, or even think about, can we arrange for somebody to escort that person to their vehicle? And also, and this has come up a number of times, where there's a potential, right, for the person who's the abuser to show up. And so actually working with like if you have a security office or even the front desk staff, to sort of know the name, perhaps have a picture, have a code word, right, if this person shows up, so that you can be prepared for that. Because a lot of this, again, it's not that you're predicting it's going to happen. It's you got to be prepared for it to happen. And I guess the other thing too I would mention about some of this on the support side of it is that it's really important not to be prescriptive as a leader, not just like, you have to do these things. You really have to understand what's going on for that person to the extent that they're willing to share that with you. And then think about, how can we work together to make, and it may involve other people. You may need to talk to your boss. You may need to involve HR on some of these things. But the point is, as a leader, don't overlook or absolve yourself from trying to help this person, because they're going to trust. If they're going to trust anybody, they're going to trust you. They're going to look to you for that help. They're going to look to their coworkers to the extent that they're willing to expose themselves a little bit to some of this. And so they need to know that, are you really genuinely concerned for their safety and well-being? And keep in mind, we haven't touched on this, but, oftentimes these incidents of workplace violence, I'm not saying all the time, but oftentimes, some of these same things, right, help you to prevent that. An example that I can give without getting into too many details is literally a situation where an individual was being picked on by some of their coworkers, and the person was getting more and more agitated. And people got concerned. And one day this person shows up, and you could tell there was something really unusual going on. And what transpired was, had to go to the car with the person, discover that they had a number of loaded guns in their vehicle, and they absolutely intended to go into the workplace and exact revenge. Right? And the only reason that didn't happen was, one, people were on alert that, okay, there's something, this person, we need to be a little mindful. They're pretty agitated. Two, people were knowing, well, hey, look for this person, and then how to handle that in a way that wouldn't escalate the situation. But that little bit of difference prevented what could have been a pretty dramatic situation, and not getting on the news and all those other kinds of things.
Wow. Yeah. That's something to pause for there, for sure. Just think about what you can do and how you can help people, for sure. Now, what about when I do need to go to HR? How do I handle that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, okay. Now we can remove the trigger warning for the HR people. Yeah. So clearly, and you mentioned this, Stacey, if your company has policies around domestic violence, which are, in some organizations, they're out there. They may be a little unusual, but certainly if you have like workplace violence policies, those things, absolutely important to take a look, be aware of that, and as a leader, know what your responsibilities are under that. And that may talk about, hey, here's the protocol for contacting HR or security, those sorts of things. But more generally, certainly if there's some immediate threat or danger, either to the person that you're talking with or coworkers and generally, absolutely you do want to contact HR, and you probably want to contact other people in the management team just in order to protect the people in the workplace. The other thing that can happen too is certainly when that person is at a point where they're ready to have a conversation with HR, because maybe they do want to access the EAP, or maybe they want to access benefits that are available to them for counseling or other things. And then so you as a leader may feel like, okay, that's really not an area I can add much value to. They really do need to talk to somebody else. But one of the caveats is to make sure you understand who is it that they're going to end up talking to in HR, and maybe you facilitate that introduction, right? And you may even want to have I'll call it a little pre-conversation with the person in HR to let them know, hey, here's what's been happening. Here, the person is asked to have the conversation and to want to stay involved, because for that individual, what they don't want to feel is like, okay, now my leader has just passed me off to HR, and they may not want to be involved in this anymore. So you don't want to get in a competing situation with HR, but I think you do want to let that person know, hey, I'm going to try to walk beside you with this so that you're not on your own, and that you don't feel that HR is coming into this without information and suddenly it becomes about compliance and policies and rules and all those things. Because remember, yes, you have to be concerned about those things, but at the end of the day, you're still dealing with a human being. And that person has to know, the care doesn't stop the minute they get turned over to HR, because that can actually do more damage for that person and break that trust, right, that they have. So those are some things when you would want to get there. If the person, now, if we go from the victim to talking about, let's say you may have somebody who's an abuser in the workplace, you don't necessarily want to call up HR and say, I kind of think maybe, right? If you're either going to know it's the case that, hey, somebody's heard something, I've heard something, or you may have enough facts to say, hey, it really warrants an investigation. And there you may want to ask HR to get involved, because HR will typically be able to get more detail and better understand, okay, what's going on? How has this person been doing this? And then can help you. It doesn't mean you, as a leader, you just back away completely, but they can help you understand, hey, how are we going to handle this, right? For not only how we're dealing with this employee who may be doing inappropriate things, but also how do we protect the other people in the workplace. So those are some examples, I think, of when you would engage with HR. So very clearly, don't want to leave anybody with the impression if there's an immediate danger or a threat, then absolutely. But don't just call HR. Make sure you're talking to other people on the management team around you, right? Because those peers can also help you with some of the circumstances as well.
Yeah, I think that's good. And I think this is a good place for us to say, look, we are not legal experts. Kim, you have a great background in HR, but that doesn't mean that what Kim is saying is the way that your organization wants you to handle things. So I think checking in and making sure that you're following up with that is really important. Treat this as guidance, some ideas to give you. And I think whenever in doubt, ask others. Like you said, talk to your leader, talk to your peers, talk to HR and say, what's the best way to handle this? And you are the leader, you know your team members best. So I always tell people, when you go to HR, you still know your team member best. They're going to give you guidance and tell you what is proper for the organization, what the organizational rules are, maybe some legal pieces, and then you can chime into, okay, this is where this team member's at, and it's not the time to let you have a conversation with them. They're not ready for that. I just needed some guidance as a leader of how to handle it right now, and I'll stay connected with you and keep you updated. That is absolutely okay. So, just things to think about there. Anything to add on that, Kim?
No, I think it covers, Stacey. To your point, we obviously in the course of our conversation here couldn't cover every situation or think about all the aspects of it. And, we didn't touch on things like, hey, if a person needs counseling, right? Or do they need to talk to their doctor about some of these sorts of things? Those are also considerations. But those are things that, again, I would advise most leaders to stay away from, because we're not medical doctors. We're not therapists. So venturing into those waters can be actually unhelpful. But just realize those are some of the other resources that become available. And probably the only thing I would add to it is just as a leader, and this is even outside of HR, is just think about the fact that if you suspect something like this is going on, or maybe something is going on, there are some tremendous resources out there that you can guide that person to. Again, it's up to them to pick up the phone, to reach out. But just because sometimes people don't know these things exist, And when they're in the middle of it, they may not even have the focus or the energy to reach out. And so being able to say, hey, here's some places that you could potentially go, which could be the EAP and those sorts of things. But, there are some great organizations out there that provide support for people.
Yeah. So before we wrap, why don't you real quick, do you have a couple organizations that you'd like to mention?
Yeah. So I would say on a national level, there's actually a couple really good organizations that are out there. So one of those is the 24-hour National Domestic Violence Hotline that you can find on the internet. Their number is 800-799-7322, which also that 7322 stands for SAFE. Another one, because again, people may tend to think about, oh, well, this is a situation that arises between people who are married or otherwise have a really long relationship, but this can happen in a dating situation. So there's another organization, which is the National Dating Abuse Hotline. And that's an 866-331-9474 number. And we will certainly put some of this, I think, into the...
Yeah, we'll put in the show notes for sure.
But to do that. And then just keep in mind at the state level, but also at the local level, there can be a lot of excellent resources that are available to people with just a little bit of work. And we'll also, I think, put some things in there to help people. Like if you're a leader and you're trying to find some of these resources, there's some great places you can go to that really give you a pretty comprehensive list. In North Carolina, one organization that I in particular want to mention is the Jamie Kimball Foundation for Courage. The foundation was founded by Jamie's parents. Jamie actually lost her life within an abusive relationship that the abuse was going on for a number of years. And I won't go through the whole story, but Jamie, I think, was really hoping the relationship would work out. And ultimately it didn't. And so her parents founded it not only to make sure other people didn't have to go through what they went through with their daughter, but also to create education and awareness of some of this. And so they're a very good organization, and we can put their website into the notes as well. But there are organizations like this in different states. In fact, just before our podcast, I went out and I looked in Michigan. Stacy, there's one that's the Women's Resources Center up in Traverse City. And it looks like they have a very, very good program also available for people who may be in these situations where it's domestic violence or abusive relationships, whether that's in dating or otherwise. So the resources are out there. But again, like most things, we don't tend to think about it until we need it. And then we scramble at the last minute trying to find out how do we give people access.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you. Thank you, Kim, for, joining this podcast, talking about this important topic. I hope for the leaders out there, we gave you some tips and tools for things to look for, how to act when you see some of those things, and how you can be a leader of this world and not just a leader of your team and helping everyone and anyone around you. So thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today, Kim.
All right, Stacey. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about it. Again, the leaders are not going to have perfect, knowledge of all these things, but the important part is to just demonstrate that you care, that you're really interested in that person. And just, again, I'll just go back to the simplest thing. Don't ignore it. Just, are you okay? And then just see what unfolds and let that person know that you're there, that you and the people around them are concerned about them and you're willing to help when they're ready.
Love that. Love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that concludes another episode of Leadership Moments. We hope you found inspiration and valuable insights in what we shared today. Remember, leadership is not defined solely by titles or positions, but by the choices we make and the moments that shape us.
Embrace the challenges that come your way, for they may be the very moments that propel you toward greatness. We'd love to hear your thoughts and stories as well. Connect with us on our website at leadershipmomentspodcast.com or through social media on Instagram at Tracy_Ann Palmer.
And Stacey Kester _. Remember, your leadership moment could be just around the corner, waiting for you to seize it. This is Stacey Kester, and what doesn't challenge you won't change you.
And this is Tracy Ann Palmer. And be the change you wish to see in the world.